would like to talk about a couple of the things he said, which I found really interesting and typical of the United States in a way we should be very concerned about. He seems to think that a war, a costly one to boot, is somehow a necessary evil for a country. I wish that were true, but it isn't. And the strange thing is for an American to do that. Our capitalist system had collapsed in 1929. We had an economy with levels of unemployment in the double digits into the 25% level in 1933. We had a cut in our total output. That is, we didn't increase our economy, we shrank it. We had devastation across the country. And everything the government tried didn't work. It seemed to work a little bit in 1937, and then it collapsed later in that same year. You know what finally lifted the United States out of its depression? It was the war. During the war, they took half the unemployed people and stuck them in a uniform. And the other half they put to work making the uniforms and the guns and the bullets. It brought the United States out of a war. It produced a military-industrial complex that has been a sustainer of American capitalism ever since, even though it is much more costly than the Russian wars ever were, including this one. But the United States seems to think that the war is a cost that can only have some sort of negative effect on an economy. Does it have negative effect? Of course. People die. Resources are wasted. But it also has all kinds of other effects, which American history is the number one example of. When Mr. Roosevelt took the United States into World War II, he rescued the economy, and everybody with half a brain knows it. So I'm astonished when my colleagues write articles about how much the war must be costing. Where were those articles back in the 1940s? The war was costing? No. The war was saving democracy and just coincidentally saving the capitalist system. Guess what? It's doing comparable things for the Russia of Mr. Putin. And if you actually wanted to know it, just look at the polls. Mr. Putin's popularity makes that of Western leaders look like the disaster it is. The politicians of Western Europe, together with those of the United States, are becoming, and I know it upsets them, historical relics. They strike me as fighting the old Cold War as if it had never ended. They learned their craft during the Cold War, and it just conditioned them that the way you make your way, whether you're in a conservative party or a liberal party or a labor party, you make your way on the conservative side by being a cheerleader for capitalism and putting as much hatred on the Soviet Union or Russia, but you got to put some hatred somewhere. So even if Mr. Putin asks to be in NATO, you're not going to deprive us of the person we can fight against, we can claim is the enemy of democracy. The conservative leaders of Europe, who used to tell us that communism and socialism are the great enemies. Look how easily socialism and communism were replaced by Russia and China. They need somebody to juxtapose. It's in their way. They don't know how to deal with a world that isn't divided into the good guys and the bad guys with a need to show how loyal you are to the good guys and how determined you are to fight the bad guys. Look at Ukraine itself. Its leader is a joke. The most corrupt government in Europe. To make a genius leader saving his people, you know what that's called? That's a reach, because it is so difficult not to start laughing at the very project. But no. In the great struggle of good and evil, we know Mr. Zelensky is on the right side, so he is good. His denial of civil liberties in his country, we do not discuss. Mr. Putin's, we make a big deal. It's childish behavior, and in the long run, millions of people will recognize it for what it is. The post-World War II deal was that the United States would provide a military umbrella and that the European countries would not have to develop their military because they could rely on the United States against the evil Russians. The United States undertook to do that because it meant an immense flow of money to the military-industrial complex that would otherwise have been cut off since World War II was over and you didn't need to spend that kind of money on a war that you weren't fighting. So you had a new kind of war, the Cold War, and the role of Europe as the great front line. And what this allowed the Europeans to do was to reposition their conservatives into power. How? Because the money that the conservatives didn't have to spend on military, they could spend on making themselves rich, but also funding a welfare state, because otherwise their own people would have made a revolution. Let's remember, after World War II, communists were in the cabinet and the government in France and Italy. That whole resistance against the Nazis was led by socialists and communists, etc., etc. So that was the deal. They'd buy off their own people with a welfare state. By the way, one more generous than anything the United States was willing to do, and that has been true ever since to this day. So for Mr. Trump to tell them, I'm going to hit you with a tariff and I'm going to press you to spend 5%. Where's that going to come from? Either the people who run the society will have to take the wealth away from the rich, which they can't do because that's their only real support, or they'll have to cut the welfare program. And with the size of the left in their countries and the size now of the right, that's their political undoing. So he's putting them in an impossible position. By the way, the same applies to Mexico. If he in fact deports millions of people and he puts a tariff on Mexican goods coming into the U.S., that means millions of people without work coming into Mexico looking for jobs. The tariffs, by cutting off a part of their export market, means that they're going to be firing people, not hiring people, because unemployment goes with losing your export. Finally, the return of millions of Mexicans not only means people coming for work that isn't there, joining their own unemployed compatriots, but the end of the workers here means the end of the flow of remittances, which has been an important part of Mexican economics. That means you are plunging Mexico into an economic catastrophe. Oh, good. That's what you want on a country you have a 1,000-mile border with, from who you haven't been able to stop the flow of immigrants before. You are creating a situation where millions of Mexicans are going to try harder to get into the United States if you do this stuff than they did before. And your crappy wall won't stop them any more than it did before. So these are policies that are theater pieces. You see, I'm a president who's going to do better for America by sticking it to the people who aren't. Those folks in Panama are overcharging us. I'm going to take... You know what this is? An impotent giant thrashing around because he can't stop the decline, and he got into office as promising to do something for the people already suffering. It's great theater. It got him into that office, but it isn't going to solve any problem. And the poor idiot is sitting up there going to preside over his own undoing, which is what he did the first time, and he'll do it again. In order to sustain the theater of Mr. Trump, he has to be able to bloviate about taking the Panama Canal and subordinating these. He can't ask, let alone answer the question, what are these countries going to do in response if we do all these things? It's as if he controls everything, and it's just been a matter of having the courage to do what his predecessors didn't do, which, by the way, is how he talked. There's nothing new about saying America first. The problem is the things he says he's going to do have open-ended contradictory consequences right across the board. Let me give you another one. When he says to the assembled Davos dignitaries, come to America. You can come to a place where we'll have the lowest taxes in the world. All right, now let me translate that. He's inviting them and he's making them a promise. And that promise is either to provide them with these lowest taxes in the world by stopping spending on the social programs that Americans need, and that's probably what he means, or he's going to go even further into deficit, which he has promised not to do, in his budgets. Otherwise, he can't deliver the lowest taxes in the world. Come on. If the American people paid attention, they'd realize he's telling the rest of the world, come here because we're going to give you, in fact, not just the lowest taxes, but we're going to compete on wage levels with the rest of the world. Because unless he does, they're not going to come because it doesn't pay. The wages here remain much too high and the market is not growing anywhere near fast enough. If they hadn't been that way, we would have seen the arrival of large numbers of manufacturing jobs. Let me be very blunt. Every one of the last dozen presidents has made the remark, often in their inauguration, how it's terrible manufacturing has declined and as they're committed to bringing manufacturing back. And manufacturing never came back. Because they didn't believe in it? Of course they did. But the economic truths of the system mean that capitalists around the world would be nuts to come here. This is a declining empire. This is a country divided politically with a level of hostility and animosity that ought to make you wonder. You spend a lot of money investing here, you've got a leader who will take that away from you whenever it's convenient. Look what he's doing to his close allies, to the countries that have done a lot for the United States, which is Canada, Mexico, I'll omit Greenland, or Panama. That's why every president's invitation to manufacturers has gone unheeded. The percentage of our economy that's manufacturing is ridiculously low, has been at that and stayed at that across all the presidential bloviating to the contrary. The economics that you teach in the school that is informing Mr. Trump's advisors may be giving him the idea, based on a little model that they worked out when they were 12 years old, that if A happens, then B, then C, and then D. And all the rest of the universe is going to be quiet and not interfere in this nice A, B, C, D story. I mean, that's how I was taught in the university. And I knew as a student that this was nuts, that this was fantasy. And, you know, the history of economics is people who come along and say, that truism, here's 6 examples where it didn't work, and blows it up and gets, by the way, a good job doing that. And then unfortunately sinks back into doing more of those little models as if he didn't learn from his own success. It's silly. Maybe Mr. Trump knows somewhere what kind of a hustler he is. I will continue my career by snatching the Panama Canal away from that country. I'm going to pit the United States with its nuclear arsenal against all 11 members of the Panamanian military. You know, it's going to lead Americans at some point to say, you know, if you have a problem with the rate structure of ships passing through the canal, what you do is call for a meeting, send your foreign minister, have a conference, raise a question, solicit proposal. You jumped over all of the rest to threaten people. If he proceeds, he's going to be in trouble. If he drops it, it will not be forgotten. This is a man who's presiding over a sinking ship. But to avoid the other people noticing, he keeps saying, look at how we came over this wave. Yeah, sir, but the ship is sinking. It is hard for an economy and an empire to decline. But the best way to do it is to face it and to sit down with the others on this planet to work out a way to make that a livable experience for all of us.